My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to How to Disaster, a podcast to help communities recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I'm so happy today to have Debbie Mason here with me. Debbie Mason is one of my most admired colleagues, and she has recently moved back to her home state of Florida. But prior to that, she spent about 2 years creating a mental health care collaborative. Debbie, welcome to How to Disaster.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here and share a little bit and learn from others as well. So it's a journey we all need to do collectively. I'm glad to be a part of it.
I like to tell people that you are one of the most impressive people that I saw step up post-disaster. Mental health is something that we struggle with, outside of a disaster, and then something as monumental as what happened in 2017 occurs in a community. And mental health care becomes one of our most important tools for how we're going to recover. Can you please tell us a little bit about your personal fire story, where you were working, and the path that took you to create this collaborative?
I came to Sonoma County in 2016. I had been visiting Sonoma County and spending a lot of time out there since the late 80s and said, one day I'm going to live out here. It's an amazing place. So I had the opportunity to move there, and I came, luckily enough, for an amazing position as CEO of the Healthcare Foundation, Northern Sonoma County. And in that first year, working with my board, we identified mental health as a critical need. And so that was already a platform for us. And as to my personal fire story, I'm a Floridian and we do hurricanes. And hurricanes are much easier than fires. And everybody said to me, why would you go back to Florida? You have hurricanes. I'm like, look, you know a hurricane's coming about a week in advance. That's a really beautiful time period to figure out, am I going to leave the area or am I going to bunker in and watch what happens and figure it out? But with a fire, you don't get that notification. And, my own fire story of watching the fires rim around Healdsburg in 2017, which was where I was living, was very, very frightening. And literally, I had no family there. I was lucky enough to have friends, but most of them were in the fire area too. And I ended up camping out on my board chair's couch, who's a lovely individual with a packed house of her own family, dogs, cats, kids, people. And I was grateful to have her and her family there. But it was very scary. And I, from that point of that first fire, never unpacked my go bag. It stayed ready from that point on.
Very smart. I was so excited just to put my go bag in the closet about a week ago. Just
right.
Fire season.
Exactly. Fire season's over. Just move it in the closet, but leave it like it is.
That's right. So, okay. So you see what happens to our community. You are evacuated. But how did you even find out, or how did you even decide to step into the space of creating this collaborative?
It sort of happened serendipitously. Before the fires, because our board, through its strategic planning, had identified mental health as a pillar, I was doing outreach to connect with professional mental health groups. So connecting with the local group of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, identifying everybody who was in the mental health space and psychologists, and saying, what kind of partnerships could we create? And also, all areas have this shortage, but Sonoma County had a severe shortage of mental health professionals, particularly Spanish language serving professionals. So we had already identified, wow, there's a huge gap of mental health professionals to begin with. And then for folks that are primary Spanish language speakers, they can wait a really long time to see a mental health professional if they can afford a mental health professional, and then free was a whole other category. So we were already kind of parsing through all that. And
I
it was
think
just,
I would like to pause there and say, actually, that is really good advice for building resiliency into your community, is that, say you haven't had a disaster yet, but you'd like to be somewhat, prepared, because we don't know what's going to happen. Right. I think COVID has certainly taught us that, but just really building that network out in advance.
Absolutely. So we were really fortunate. We had already done some listening tours around the county, and we had already done some convening of folks that were somehow in the mental health space. So we literally had a starting place of people to convene to bring together for solution building. But if we had been starting from scratch, it would have taken us that much longer, because people are displaced. So if you're trying to go through their association, well, they're not working in their office. They're not checking office emails. So the ability to already have personal cell phones and personal emails, and, like you said, building that list, building that network ahead of time is a resiliency piece.
And so how did you come to be the point person, though? Because you'd only been here for, about a minute before it happened, maybe a year. But you came to be the point person, and I don't think I sat on a panel for like a year, not where I wasn't sitting next to you in the county. So, I mean, how does that come to be, and can you talk about?
A lot to unpack there. I was the steward of my board's passion. My board was passionate that this was a need, that it disproportionately affected Latinx families and lower income families, and that had always been the voice of the Healthcare Foundation of Northern Sonoma County, and we needed to step into that void. And for a long time, I felt like I was talking to myself, because everybody was so focused on immediate needs. And I would say, yes, we have to meet immediate needs, and we have to be budgeting and fundraising and planning for this longer term wave that's going to come. So I just felt like I needed to be doggedly persistent about keeping that in front of people, because at some point they'd be ready to hear it, even if they weren't day one.
I think it's one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is the idea that they do need to sort of put something in reserve, that even though we all walked around saying this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. I think I've heard that 500 times, and in every other community that we've worked with post-disaster, but actually understanding that you really are going to be at mile 7, 13, 16, 20, and that's when you sort of get tired, and it's a marathon that nobody's really training for. And so it can be a hard message for people to hear, that we need to reserve our some cash, some energy, and some of our efforts for years 2 through 10, essentially.
Right. And I also think it's human nature to want to fix all the problems now. And we have to remember that some of our brother and sisters already walk in uncomfortable situations. And when a disaster happens, they slip back even further. And so at some point, you have to say to yourself, am I bringing that person to what hole was before the disaster? Or am I trying to take them exponentially to another level? And those are really difficult conversations to have as human beings, because we want everybody to be well and good.
And sometimes it's really hard to hear that you can't go back. Like, I think that that's one of the messages that we do try to share with newly disaster affected communities is you can't go back to your October 7th. Like, that moment is gone, and that's hard to let go of. But you can reimagine how you'd want your future to be.
Well, Jennifer, that's exactly an important part of the mental health response strategy. And you have to come to that aha moment on your own. You know, everybody I knew in the space of recovery had our own mental health advisor that we saw regularly. I mean, I remember being on a panel where everybody on the panel, all of us said, yeah, I see somebody. Yeah, I see a professional. Yeah, I need help. I'm completely fine to say I need help. It wasn't until my therapist said, hey, you can't go back. Remember, what you had before will never exist again. Come to grips with that. How do you come to grips with that? And then you can get to the third word of your slogan, which I love, which is now let's reimagine what it can be, will be, should be going forward. But there's this period of mourning that has to happen with all of us at varying degrees, depending on what our loss was or what our stress level was, to come to grips with it's never going to be like it was, and you really gotta own that. Big step.
Big step. Can you talk to us about how the Healthcare Foundation found the funding, or talk to us about how you started to build out all the components of the network? I really do love that you were specifically focused on the high need populations, high need, low resource. But how did you even, I think that there was a federal grant. Is it called the HOPE grant?
Well, we brought together all of the mental health experts from the local associations and said, we will commit as the Healthcare Foundation to finding the money. Y'all are the experts. You tell us, what does best practice look like in disaster mental health response? So those practitioners, they're just amazing people, took it upon themselves to reach out to national experts to find out internationally what had been the mental health practices that had been measured and could be considered best practices. And then we just also had some really innovative thoughts of, and what would fit locally on top of that, which is how we came to yoga and iRest, which people all over the country poo-pooed us for, but it worked. We actually saw the data. It worked.
Well, and talk about what made the yoga different, because what you ended up doing was training hundreds, if not thousands, of people in trauma-informed care, and that includes yoga teachers.
Right. So we took yoga teachers and said, we know you're already doing classes. Can you incorporate this in at least some of your classes? And we'll pay you to do these classes for fire survivors. And our definition of fire survivor, by the way, was anyone who felt affected. You didn't have to have anything burn in the fire, but if you felt affected, which frankly was every human being in the county, we wanted you to have those resources. So we trained the yoga instructors in trauma-informed yoga, which is a particular practice of yoga that opens the body, creates calm, releases feelings. And then iRest meditation, which is a documented recovery strategy for folks recovering from trauma. And so we had a legion of yoga instructors where we could have classes all over the county at different times and different days and different places that people could drop into.
And it wasn't just in English, too. For those who are not aware, in Sonoma County, we have at least 27% of our population, about a little over 100,000, probably more though, Latinos, and they are the backbone of our community and of our economy. They're incredibly important to us on a multitude of levels. But like you said before, accessing care is very difficult. It's very expensive, and if you can afford it, then it actually has to be made available too. So I love, like, I'm on the board of La Luz, and they they still have exercise classes for free in Spanish. Yeah.
That was really important to us. So at first we started by trying to identify yoga instructors that already had practices of Spanish speaking clientele. And then what we realized was we were going to be more successful at reaching those with the highest need if we went to partners that were already in the community. So that's when we searched out La Luz and others that already were serving clients and said, how can we incorporate this for your clients for free? We'll pay for it, but let's make sure your clients have access to this. And we also reached out to some of the organizations that serve our undocumented neighbors, because it was important that folks who are sometimes perceived as invisible didn't have to worry about fear in getting help.
That's a big part if you do have an undocumented population in your community, and most communities in America do, that any kind of disaster from COVID to a wildfire to a hurricane, they have an extra added layer of fear going into shelters. Will ICE be there? They certainly can't access all of the services made available. They don't have access to unemployment insurance. So giving them access to mental health care whenever possible is incredibly important and deeply humane. So I really love that.
A good partner for reaching high need, low income, and undocumented populations in any community across America would be the federally qualified health centers in those communities, because they're receiving federal dollars to serve anyone and everyone at a low income level. And they often are the medical center of service to undocumented folks. And so they're also a very good pathway into how, and many of them offer mental health services too. Not all, but many. And so, for folks listening that are in different communities trying to figure out how am I going to build these partnerships in advance, we've identified the local mental health professional chapters, but don't forget about the FQHCs, because they can be really valuable partners.
That's great advice. Thank you. Can you talk to us about your work with the school district and how you provided services to children post-disaster?
We approached the school system on a number of different levels. So we approached it at the county level, and what I learned is California school districts are different than Florida school districts, so they may be different in other areas too. In Sonoma County, you have the macro county organization, which really serves as a consultant to the individual township unit school boards. So we did reach out to the macro and said, let us integrate into your training and be a part of our steering committee. So we had a county school board representative that actually was a part of helping us build the language of the app that we created, and helping us from an advisory perspective on the advertising campaign to reach people. But then we reached out to the individual districts and said, let us pay for yoga. Let us teach. We're bringing in international experts to teach skills for psychological recovery for free. Let's make sure some of your school psychologists and school nurses get into these trainings to bring that training back into your school. And it took a little while because schools had their own thing coming down from the federal government. But after a little while, we started to see those folks coming into sort of the countywide system we created and getting that free training and taking it back in.
So was part of it that there was an emotional resistance to having an outside come in because they already had their own programs, or what was the resistance there?
Schools do have their own trainings and their own training protocols, and they are their own universes. They're very closed often to wrap around the families and children. And so sometimes you kind of have to beat on the door to get heard that you're offering something and you want them to be at the table with you. And, in their defense, lots of people approach them with lots of different ideas, and it probably gets pretty tiring to weed out which ones of these are really evidence-based and which ones of these aren't, and what do we have the bandwidth to do. And then they're all reeling too. They're all residents of the county dealing with their own individual issues and dealing with loss. So a lot of their students were moved and affected because of fires. A lot of their teachers were wrapped into their own losses. So I don't ever look at these things and say, well, gosh, it was this one thing. It was just in a post-disaster situation, there are many mitigating factors. And so, I always tell everybody the key to my success in disaster recovery is consistency with the message and doggedly persistent about continuing to bang on doors that I know could really benefit. And at some point, it'll be the right time for them to hear it.
I think that that is an incredibly valuable lesson for anyone who has who post disaster, everyone's traumatized in a community. And I often talk about this in terms of the public sector, that everyone looks to the public sector and says, okay, fix what just happened, be the recipient of all my trauma and grief, and also carry on doing everything you were doing before. And what I've seen is a public sector, some electeds are made for it and they can, step into that space. Others, though, are more traumatized by it and struggle with it. And then as far as staff is concerned, it's much the same. Like a lot of them lost their homes and they were deeply traumatized, and they still had to work in the EOC for 12, 15, 16 hours a day, and then have all of these, town meetings. And there was a lot going on, but we forget sometimes that our people who are in positions of service to the community are also traumatized themselves, and that will inform their readiness to take the next step or not, or how their ability to do their jobs at the same time trying to come to terms with their own grief.
Very true. That's such a true statement. And, I think about on my own, the people that I know that were locked in the EOC serving our community, and their houses burned down. And they literally were living out of their car or at friend's house when they got to be out of the EOC, and they didn't even have time to take care of their own needs because they were so busy caring for community. And, that's just a beautiful sense of service. Public servant is really a real title for people who work in government and do such a remarkable job for us.
I totally agree. And I feel very fortunate to have had that experience working alongside some of the most wonderful human beings I have ever worked with have been in public service. So I agree. Can you actually talk to us about the app that you all created? I think that people would love to hear about that, and who it was targeting, and what was the level of engagement?
So we were really fortunate. One of the partners we identified was the local chapter of the American Psychologists Association. And Dr. Christine Neighbor and Dr. Adrian Hines were the leads for that. Christine was the president and Adrian was very engaged. Adrian, who lives in Healdsburg and was affected by the fires, actually also worked for the Department of Defense for the Veterans Administration on technology-based healthcare resources. So Adrian dialed us very quickly into let's develop an app, and she gets all the credit for that, and really worked with the app developer on the content. And she did the very same thing for COVID. She developed an app for COVID as well, and for free. Never got paid, never looking for money. But we made sure the app was bilingual. We also made sure that the app had a special section targeting youth, because we know youth would rather do it on their phones. They'd rather talk to you on the phone, even if you're across the dinner table. They're still texting you. You're like, I'm right here. Talk to me live. Nope, want to text you. So we thought the app would reach first of all, people that might be far from resources and not have transportation, because a lot of low-income folks rely on their phone as they're tethered to the world. They might not have internet in the house, they might not have other things, but they've got a phone, and so that gives them some freedom and some liberty and some information. But for kids and teens in particular, we knew that app could be a bridge. And indeed it was. We got some really great testimonials from folks that were able to use the app. And the app had several intervention strategies. One was what I call the casual visitor. And the casual visitor was an approach of, how are you feeling today? Are you mad? Are you sad? Are you fuzzy mental headed? Can you not sleep? And it was kind of what I call like a symptom based approach. And you could go in and it would give you some strategies to help you with that. Some folks learned that you could set up an account and you could measure your own progress over time. Those folks saw tremendous gain because they were able to say, I'm going to take these assessments every day and measure how I'm feeling and be able to track, am I feeling any better in any of these areas? So we tried to approach it on what would work regardless of how you would enter the system.
So Debbie, from what I understand, your app developer then created one that works with COVID, and COVID has been a particularly strange puzzle and a strange disaster because it's global, but it's also prevents us from doing the number one thing that will help us post-disaster, which is gather together. So can you talk to us about how that app has made a difference, or if you're aware of in this region?
Well, the COVID app is built on the same resiliency and response strategies that you would find in the fire app. It's just not customized to fire.
Visit a local manufactured home retailer to get started and ask them about cross-mod homes that qualify for the MH Advantage financing. With customizable layouts and features, and surprisingly affordable mortgage financing options, take the first step forward in rebuilding your vibrant community, your town, your paradise, with an MH Advantage qualifying home today.
So, Debbie, we are actually 3 years out from our disaster, and this podcast is meant to help people who are a little closer to the event. Can you kind of go through some of your top 3 pieces of advice? And also, I'm going to ask you at the end of that to really talk about some of the things that you would have done differently or mistakes that were made, because we think that's a really important element of getting through the disaster, is being, brutally honest.
Okay, so 3 pieces of advice. It's never too late to build a network of partners, even if you're not sure how you're going to partner with them. Creating relationships, understanding what different organizations do, what constituencies they serve, and a little asset mapping. Who's got what strengths, who's got what outreach, who has what resources, so when disaster does hit, you know who and how to share. That would be my number 1 piece of advice.
I think it can be really hard to share. I had to once tell somebody who's almost in the same space as I was, who was getting very protective. And I was like, there's enough disaster to go around. That's the one thing that I'm sure of, is that we have to be able to share. What's one of the mistakes that you made, something you would have done differently?
I would have anticipated that the cycle for response to help with mental aid is a lot longer than you think it's going to be. So what I mean by that is, normally the curve, if there is one, is somewhere between 6 and 9 months. Someone who's been through something traumatic, if they haven't already sought help, will say, okay, I thought I could tough my way through this, but clearly I need help. In a fire situation where there's repeat relighting, literally, of the trauma, there's a fire and then you're okay, and then there's another fire, that whole fire season is now half the year. It may take people longer than that to realize that they need help. The last fire for Sonoma County was 2 weeks after I left in 2019. And I was traumatized in Florida because I was so worried about all my family and friends, even though I was so relieved to say, oh, I'm so glad I'm not there living it. And then one weekend I said, but I am living it. I'm just now living it across the country because I know what everybody's going through and I'm not there to help with the recovery piece. So
that has been a huge struggle is, it feels like the fire monster at that point, when you're sitting there and you're sort of waiting for it to descend on you again. And I don't think that any of us are ever going to get used to that. So I can imagine how that would feel from across the country, like you're in it, but you're not in it. Yeah. So I do feel a hole where Debbie used to be. So I do miss you, but we're going to take that out, what I just said, because I don't want your predecessor to feel badly, but it's not the same. So I'm going to say that.
The other piece of advice I would offer people is you have to get over yourself because this is not about turf. If you're a funder or you're a make it happen organization, you need to be able to sit at the table and say, let's all divide up the roles and then let's work together collectively to identify funders, and whichever piece they fund, that's fine. But if we're all working together, we will quilt these wonderful disparate pieces into a beautiful quilt solution. And I really ran into a lot of resistance in 2017 from some funders who were, we're just going to do it. I'm like, yeah, you're going to do it, but you're only going to do these pieces. And these other pieces are equally important. And if we approach it as a collective community together, it'll really be beautiful and will attract national funding that we might not get on our own.
So Debbie, one of the things that I've noticed now doing this work constantly for 3 years is there is a dire need to actually help the helpers. And I'm very happy we interviewed First Responders Resiliency a couple of weeks ago. Susan Farron created that for peer-to-peer help mental health care for families of first responders and for first responders themselves. And now that we are 3 years out, some of my colleagues that I was so happy to work with, the first 2 years in particular, have not been able to sustain this kind of constant focus on disaster. Did you run into that when you were still here in Sonoma County with us?
Absolutely. So remember, mental health is the lagging indicator. So the first indicator is how many people are still displaced by homes, how many people still need food, cars, all that daily living assistance. So by the time we had attention to raise serious dollars to fund the strategies and start implementing the strategies, we were 6 months after the first wave, even though we were talking and opening doors during that first 6 months and planning the right strategies. So there is a fatigue factor, there is a dropout factor, and even amongst donors, even amongst professionals, it's like, why are you still talking about that? Surely people are over it. It's like, no, some people are just getting to the point of realizing they need help. Folks, there's so little that we as Americans understand, unfortunately, about good mental health and positive mental health strategies, even without a disaster. So add the disaster part on it, and that knowledge base goes even smaller, even among mental health professionals. A lot of the mental health professionals we approached about training for skills for psychological recovery said, I'm a psychologist, I don't need that. And we said, well, actually, yes, you do. The evidence shows that if you approach disaster mental health in a traditional therapeutic clinical model, you may actually harm people versus help people. And their eyes would get this big. We'd say, look, just look at the data, look at the studies, and then come for free for the skills for psychological recovery training, which is a recovery and resiliency-based approach to trauma. It's not ongoing therapy. And so even among mental health professionals, we had a long education curve. But you're absolutely right. It requires a long-term staying power.
It really does. And I like to remind people that because a lot of the communities that we're working with right now, they're in the I almost call it like a hero stage. And that's right, the disaster has just happened. They've stepped into that space. Some of them have sacrificed their entire lives to it. And now they're, between 2 and 6 months out. And so that it's almost an addiction, how people will step into the space of service, and you can actually pour your entire self out and forget that if you are going to do a marathon, you actually have to take care of yourself. You have to try meditation or breathing. I know that I had to stop everything and learn how to breathe and meditate and make sure that I exercised and ate right. And even then it could be a struggle, because when you're like, oh, there's this much more important thing to happen that, I need to do or take care of somebody else. But it's really important to always remember that, it's the land of 1,000 heroes. You don't need to be the hero. You need to do things that are perhaps never to mistake yourself for being an actual hero, I guess is what I want to say very inarticulately. And that you're just a person like everybody else, and you have the same needs as everybody else, which means to take care of yourself and to allow yourself to be cared for.
That's so important. It's very easy to get wrapped up in I should do more, but you really have to have a clear mind. And in order to have a clear mind, you've got to take care of yourself. Otherwise, you're not effective, and you're actually potentially hurting the mission instead of helping the mission.
I totally agree. Debbie, is there any last words you'd like to leave us with today, or any resources that you want to recommend? We can always drop them into the slide or below in the chat part.
I do think sharing the COVID app would be very helpful for folks, because it does have a lot of the resiliency factors in there that Dr. Hines created in the initial fire app. Also, if the free yoga and iRest are still being offered, that would be a wonderful thing to be able to direct back to the Healthcare Foundation, Northern Sonoma County's website, or however they're linking into that free yoga opportunity as well.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us. And we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.